that one? Okay, can everybody hear me? Yes, definitely. No? Was there a no? I'm Sandy MacDonald, and I'm Head of Sustainability at Standard Life. I'm just going to take a few moments just to welcome you here to Standard Life. Delighted to be able to host David Hume Institute lecture tonight with Naomi Eisenstadt. I have a few housekeeping notes, I'm afraid, so I'll try and keep them brief. The first is, with it being an evening, we have no planned fire alarm tests. I'm not sure anything would take in this weather anyway, but if it does, there are green fire exit signs. If you have any particular accessibility requirements and you're not sure about following those signs, make yourself known to either myself or Kirsty or Elsa, and we'll help you out. The toilets, if you've not already found them, there's two sets of toilets out in the kind of hallway there on this floor. The gents is the nearer one, the ladies the other side. There will be drinks afterwards, again in the far end of this floor, near where you hung your coats, so please do stay, you're very welcome. And then finally there is, because of various data protection and regulation and things like that, we can't let people kind of in the building unescorted, so at the end we'll escort people out in similar ways to how we brought people in, so I'm sorry if it takes a bit of time, or if you wanted to just make a kind of surreptitious escape, but we'll try and manage it and get everybody out when they want to go at any point. So again, just let yourself know, and thanks to Kirsty, Elsa and Sandra have been helping bringing people up. I'm now going to hand over to Ray, who's going to introduce our speaker this evening.
Very good, thank you. I'm Ray Perman, I'm Director of the David Hume Institute. In fact, can I first of all thank Standard Life and particularly Sandy for hosting us here this evening in a room with one of the best views in Edinburgh. I'm sorry about the security, it's because the floors down below manage my pension, and I need it to get as much rest and recuperation as I can, so you're not allowed to disturb it. 50 years ago, I was a maths student, among other things, and I'm sure that I remember that we were taught how to construct theoretical models, including a three-sided fence in that sort of theoretical universe. And I'm sure that Naomi Eisenstadt in that theoretical universe would have been on all three sides of that fence, because not only is she an academic who has studied the areas of social policy, particularly poverty and child poverty and inequality, but she's also been a practitioner running social enterprises trying to alleviate those problems of child poverty particularly. She has been in government running government schemes also aimed at alleviating those problems, and very particularly the Sure Start scheme, which was a great success and is missed by many, many people. But she's also been on the third side of the fence as a government advisor, advising on policy in these areas. And I suspect that combination of experience in those different areas is what attracted the First Minister a year or so ago to invite Naomi Eisenstadt to be her advisor on the areas of child poverty and inequality, and particularly as a critical friend of government policy in those areas. Now, because of the election, Naomi Eisenstadt is no longer a government advisor. She's unemployed as far as the Scottish Government is concerned. And so, free from those shackles of government employment, we are very delighted to have her to speak to this evening. Naomi Eisenstadt.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you very much, and mindful that I would like to be employed again, so not completely free of shackles, but those of you who know me know that I don't take much attention to it anyway. I always like to tell an Edinburgh audience that my first job in the UK was in a social services day nursery in Edinburgh, Viewforth Day Nursery, and I'd come from California, where it was a rather free and easygoing environment for young children, and the social services day nursery I went to had, when the children had tea, first of all, of course, I had a real difficulty understanding the children's accents to begin with. When the children had their tea in the nursery, we had a white piece and a brown piece, and then milk. and they had to eat their white piece first because it had a savory filling, and the brown piece second because it had jam, and then they were allowed to sip their milk. It was very different from anything I had experienced in California, but it was a good introduction to Scottish culture for me. The nicest thing that happened in that job is that I was the one who read stories to the children the whole time, and of course the stories that I read to them, they started reciting in my accent, which was fantastic. So it was great. I was appointed as the poverty, actually it's less than a year. It was April of last year before the election that Peter Housden rang me. Peter Housden rang me, and I thought he was ringing me to ask me if I knew anyone who could do the job, but he was ringing me to ask me to do it, which was very nice. But I said to him immediately, Peter, I'm assuming that my key qualifications for this job is that I'm not English or Scottish. And I do think it helps. And I do think it helps in terms of the way I've engaged in the job, but it's been fantastic to be able to do it. So what I'm going to talk about mainly is not what's in the report. At the end, I'll say a bit about what's in the report, but I think most of you have seen the report. What I want to talk about is how I went about the task of putting the report together, because I think that's more interesting, and it's interesting about policymaking and tension, and how do you manage all the tensions in an anti-poverty strategy. But of course, poverty really matters, and it matters to virtually all outcomes. It matters to health, education, not just the risk of being a criminal, but the risk of being a victim of crime. We often forget that crime rates are much higher in poor neighborhoods, and that there are real disadvantages in terms of living in poor neighborhoods in terms of crime. Poverty in childhood has a scarring effect, but I also think that we're not interested in early childhood just because reading age is at 9 or employment at 20. We're interested because it's a social justice issue, and it's not very nice. You know, most of the people in this room, I'm assuming, have had reasonably privileged lives, maybe not. If you haven't, then you know it's not very nice. I've had a reasonably privileged life, but I've worked in low-income estates for a very long time and have some sense of how difficult it is. So what did I want to do first when I was asked to do it? I was appointed as the independent, that's a very important word, advisor on poverty and inequality. And so what I wanted to do firstly was, when I met with Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, was to find out what her priorities are, because it's a very, very wide brief, and I knew that it was a short time that we had to do it. I knew that it would finish before the elections in May. So the first thing I asked her was, is your priority poverty or inequality? Because they're different. And we talk about them as if they're the same things, but in fact the policies you need to do to address that are different. And I didn't want to, because we had a short time, I wanted to make sure I was working to an agenda that she wanted. And she immediately said it was poverty. Not that she's not interested in inequality, but for this task she wanted poverty. And then there were a set of questions about, so what do we mean? In terms of poverty, do we mean increasing family incomes? Or do we mean reducing the chances of poverty in the next generation? Do we mean reducing the social class gradient? Because there is a social class gradient on almost all outcomes, on education, on health, on crime. There's a social class gradient. So do we want to flatten that gradient? Or do we want to have fewer poor children? Or do we want to have fewer poor adults? So what we did was a staged and what I call an iterative process. Because what I wanted first for Scotland was to establish the numbers. So which groups are we most worried about? How many in each group? How poor are they? Are they just on the margins, or is it very deep poverty? Are we interested in increasing family income or reducing family costs? I consulted with academics, with voluntary organizations, with local authorities, with people living in poverty. And the most important thing was, did the numbers resonate with what people actually told me? And one of the things that, there's a lot of work done on evidence-based policy. I have to say I get really sick of that expression, because it really doesn't mean much. Because the best evidence-based program in the world is meaningless if the people who are supposed to use the program don't want to use it. But just because they use it and like it, it doesn't mean it works. So the whole notion about evidence, but my example on this is always, I have never walked onto a low-income estate and seen an 18-year-old pushing a pram, and this woman said to me, the most important thing I need is a parenting program. They don't say they want a parenting program. when we did Sure Start, the biggest test on whether they actually consulted with parents was dog shit. Because if they said they wanted the park cleaned up, we knew they spoke to parents. If the plan said we spoke to parents and they said they wanted health visitors and speech therapists, we knew they spoke to health visitors and speech therapists. Because all public servants think the answer is me. And if only there were more of me and they were as good as me, it would all be okay. But so that resonance between what people say they need and want and what concerns them, what the numbers tell you are the real issues, is a really, really important part of the task. So the other question was, that's why my report is called Shifting the Curve. Are we concerned with the very, very poorest, who have very complex problems that the Treasury used to call high cost, high harm? That's the people who probably have a drug problem and a mental health problem and live in poor housing and maybe second generation in workless household. But in fact, despite what many charities will tell you, they are very tiny in number. And if you want to shift the curve, you need to be where the big numbers are. So I asked about the numbers, and then the numbers that jumped out, that's when you said, well, which are the policies that apply to them? Are we interested in families with young children where poverty has very long-term impact? Are we interested in young adults without children who are still subject to the scarring effect of poverty well into adulthood? To be workless between 16 and 20, you have a chance of lower income by the time you're 40. You don't recover from worklessness in those late teen years. And are we interested in pensioners? Pensioners who are the deserving poor, like me, who worked their whole life and contributed, but may still be left behind. So when we did the numbers, and I have to say the analysts were completely brilliant, after housing costs, it was working age adults who were the largest number of poor people. Over half adults in poverty have a job. So it wasn't worklessness that the problem was. It was in-work poverty. And 50% of children in Scotland poor children in Scotland live in a household where at least one member of the household is in employment. So it was in-work poverty that really jumped out. The highest risk of poverty was in the private rented sector, particularly after housing costs. And that's another interesting thing. I'm not sure why we count before and after housing costs, because everybody has to live somewhere. But the really important figure, and again, the one that affects a lot of people in this room, I'm sure, as I look around, including me, is the only group where poverty numbers reduce after housing costs is pensioners. And that's because they've largely paid for their housing or are in rent-controlled accommodation. So pensioners, 15% are poor before housing costs in Scotland, 12% after housing costs. But working-age adults, it's around 20%. About 1 in 5 in work are in poverty. So it's very, very high. It's much higher than pensioners. So in terms of the process, there was a process of clarifying with the First Minister what she wanted. And I had to say to her, do you want to shift the curve or do you want to work on the tail? And the clear answer was she wanted to shift the curve. And in shifting the curve, then the obvious answer is working-age adults in work. And later on, there became a particular issue about young people, which I'll talk about in a minute. So in this process, what's worked well? Well, one of the things that worked really well was the support of the Secretariat. Being within the Scottish Government worked really well because I had somebody to look after me, I had somebody to make the introductions for me, I had somebody to do the analysis of the numbers for me, and I have to say they were incredibly patient because every time I asked a question, it led to another question. And we had a couple of false starts. Because the first thing I got was a 30-page document of every single policy in the Scottish Government that had something to do with poverty. But that was before we did the numbers. So once we did the numbers and the numbers jumped out, then we could say, what are the policies that are relevant to in-work poverty? What are the policies that are relevant to young people? So once you do the numbers, it narrows down the task. It really helped that it coincided with the Fairer Scotland process, because there were discussions going around all over Scotland on what do you think the important issues are in terms of poverty, disadvantage, and what would make a fairer Scotland. And there was also involvement in something called the Poverty and Truth Commission. Now, this was an interesting exercise where you were matched with somebody who was living in poverty and, went to meetings with them, talked with them, had conversations with them. Some civil servants did, and I was linked with Marie-Therese. And I was a bit skeptical about it to begin with. It felt a little patronizing. It felt a little uncomfortable because I wanted to know what Marie-Therese was going to get out of it as opposed to what I would get out of it. I knew what I wanted to get out of it, some more understanding, some checking out what I was thinking, but what would she get out of it? And of course what she got out of it was something about, well, how does it all work? And why doesn't it work? And why does it take so long? And why don't they listen? So I like to think, she did tell me she got a lot out of it. I like to think we did, but it was very, very helpful because she gave me access to groups of poor people that I never would have had access to. So that part of the process was really important. But there have been things that have been quite difficult. So one of the things that was difficult is the tension being independent and working within the heart of government. And Oxfam staff raised this with me, and they said, wouldn't it have been better to set up an independent poverty commission? And the reason I say no is for a couple of things. One is an independent poverty commission would have cost more because you would have had to duplicate the analytical services. You would have had to have, it would have taken longer to set up, you would have had to have more staff to do it, and you would have had to have more people to do it. But the other reason that I think was particularly productive, and there are some civil servants in the room, and I hope that they're nodding with this, is that because I was working with civil servants, we were asking each other questions, and I like to think that the way I was thinking was bringing along their thinking, and the way they were thinking was bringing along my thinking. So in terms of implementation, you've got a much better chance of implementation if the people have already shared your thinking and they've shared their thinking with you. It means that depending on what happens in May and depending on what happens with the report, depending on who the leader, the First Minister of Scotland is, these things have a much better chance of implementation if the civil servants already feel some understanding and ownership of them. And I think that really short-circuits a lot, and it makes me feel good about embedding some of that thinking into the civil service. It's not that it wasn't there, it was, but we did share a lot of the questions back and forth, and that was really, really helpful. As the Purdah period approached, it was harder to ensure non-party political positions. And you will have seen today in the press that the leader of the Labour Party has written to me personally to say that if they're elected, if they're running the government, they will implement everything. Well, I'm delighted to hear that, and I'd like to help any government in Scotland implement these recommendations. But the other thing that I think is really important in terms of the Purdah period is that I was appointed by the Scottish government, not the SNP. And when asked, the very first question I was asked by a journalist was, what happens if they don't take your advice? Well, I'm an advisor. They were elected. And I wouldn't expect any government to say, very good, Naomi, well done. What do we do first? I would expect some of it to be taken very seriously. I would expect some of it to be dismissed. That's what an advisor does. You present the arguments, you present the data, but you don't expect everybody to say, well done, great, let's get on and do it. I hope some of it will happen, but I have no expectation that everything will happen, nor would I consider that a problem. They're elected, I'm not. I was just plucked to do the work. I'm very grateful for that. It was great fun. The other thing that was difficult was there was lots of overlap with work already going on, particularly Scotland's Young Workforce, the Wood Commission, lots of other activities. And every time I met someone, they'd say to me, have you met so-and-so, and did you know that this is going on? Well, one of the problems, of course, is that there's too much going on. And whether it coalesces, and that, one of the things I used to say in the old days about New Labour is that everybody believes in joined-up government as long as they're in charge of the join-up. And that's why you have so many different joins up, because each one has to have their own thing to be joined up in. And you wind up in meetings where, you just have different hats on all the time. So there was a real difficulty about ensuring that there was added value and coherence to what I was doing. So just to go through the recommendations, in-work poverty, housing and fuel costs, and life chances of young people. I think that I'm not going to talk much about the in-work poverty thing. You know that it's already in there, building on the living wage accreditation, encouraging pay disclosure. But the one that was really important to me was the child care. because this is one area where I think there are real dangers in terms of what the Scottish Government is doing, and I have said this publicly, so I'll say it again. There is a real tension in childcare on, is the purpose child development, or is the purpose to reduce in-work poverty by having affordable childcare? And the reason that's a tension is because for employability, you want the childcare to be affordable and flexible. But for high quality that will really do the best for young children in preparation for school, you need trained teachers. You need it to be fairly inflexible, because children need a regular routine. You need to make sure that the staff, if the 3-year-old is going 2 long days, they're not going to get the same out of it as 5 half days. They're just not. If the 2-year-old is 2 long days with staff who aren't graduate qualified, who aren't teachers, they're not going to get the same out of it. They're just not. So you have to be clear what the purpose of the child care is, and politicians always want to kill at least 3 birds, if not more, with 1 stone. So the expansion of free child care has to be linked with a real commitment to quality, a real commitment to raising, and of course, in terms of in-work poverty, some of the in-work poor will be the child care workers. Because what's the employment segment that complained the most about the living wage? It was the care sector, largely female. So all the issues that we raise about gender equality, all the issues we raise about quality for children are all tied up. And I have to say that when I was a civil servant in England, and a political advisor asked me if there was any evidence that children would learn less well from 4 to 6 p.m., 3-year-olds. And of course, the person who asked me was male and hadn't been in a nursery since he was in nursery and had no children. And I said to him, nobody would be that stupid enough to do the research, because if you're ever in a nursery at 4 o'clock, we're washing the paint pots. We are not engaging at highly creative cognitive activities with children. It just doesn't work that way. So the issue about how it really works and how you make these things tie together are really important. Housing affordability, well, I have to say Scotland's doing better than England. You have stopped selling social housing. You are committed to building more social housing. You're putting in rent controls on private rented sector, but there's never enough social housing, and a commitment to more social housing. And I have to say, I met with disability groups after the report was published, and I regret that I didn't have a line that some of that housing has to be accessible, so I'll say it now. Some of the housing should be accessible. We have to make sure that we maintain that interest. And there was an issue about tax reform. Some of the local tax reform has happened. Unfreezing of council tax I'm really pleased about. But there's still issues about local decision-making versus central decision-making. And again, it's one of my favorite lines always, that everybody believes in local democracy until it's their issue, and when it's their issue, it's tell the buggers what to do. And I just did it on childcare. So I'm the same. Everybody, until it's, and that's a voluntary sector problem, because voluntary organizations will always want the center of government to do their campaigning, because they don't want to have to campaign with each local authority. So it's again, one of these tensions. So the bit that I was most interested in, and that I think is most interesting, is life chances of young people. Now, it's an odd thing for me, because I made my whole career on under 5s. My whole career was on young children, and I would say, and dare I say it, I will say it, that we have won the argument on early years. We don't have the systems in place. It's not as good as it should be, but we've won the argument. But one of the dangers of our early years argument is that there's too much presented as, and if you get it right there, it's done. It's not inoculation. It's not inoculation. Stuff happens. Stuff happens to kids past 5. And even if you didn't have a great start past 5, it doesn't mean you give up on children. In policy terms, it's incredibly dangerous to present the notion that it's all over. It is, first of all, in scientific terms, it's wrong, but also in policy terms, it's very dangerous, because it isn't all over. Because stuff happens, and everybody is retrievable. But I think that in Scotland in particular, a few things really matter about young people, and one of them is free tuition fees, which means that government is investing a huge amount in the young people who are most likely to do well, and not having a comparable investment in the young people who are choosing a different route, or a different route is chosen for them. In Scotland, you still have school leaving age at 16, and we know that the living wage will not kick in till 25. So there's a huge gap, in my view, in understanding young people and understanding their needs. And it's a very interesting time of life, as some of us remember, or some of us remember in terms of what we went through with our own teenage children, that it's a time when parents lose most control. Peers really matter. I mean, one of the odd things about adolescence is when children are physically healthiest, but their mental health needs are greatest. So the mental health risks are very high in adolescence, but they never get near a GP because their physical health is very, very good, and they can get their contraceptive advice from each other. So in terms of what are the risks in adolescence, it's a very, very important period. And I haven't made particular policy recommendations. What I'm recommending is that we need a really comprehensive look at what are the issues, what do the numbers tell us in Scotland in terms of the NEETs figures, in terms of who goes to university, who doesn't go to university, what are their opportunities, what are the pathways. And somebody in government said to me, I've got 2 children, I know one of them's going to university, and I know exactly what to do to help her on her way. I don't know what to do for my child that I know probably isn't. So that, and it's much wider than careers advice. It's about how do we'll never make a level playing field, but how do we make it less of a disaster for parents, for the child who isn't university bound? So that there are options, there are career structures, there are things to do. In the report, I had 2 cross-cutting recommendations. One is about targeted services and stigma and treating people with respect. One of the reasons that people don't like targeted services, they always say that they're stigmatized. And I don't believe this is absolutely necessary. I mean, again, my funny story is about crazy policy. This is an England crazy policy, which was called Can Parent. There was a view that some parents need help with parenting, so they gave out randomly vouchers for parenting courses. Because if they gave them to the parents they thought needed them, it would stigmatize those parents. So my answer to that is schizophrenia is stigmatizing. So we're going to randomly give out psychotropic drugs in the hope that somebody who needs them gets them, and hope that they don't do damage to anybody else. It is stupid. What we have to do is tackle the issue of stigma and deliver public services with respect. And Sure Start, my greatest achievement in Sure Start was that everybody wanted it. I was criticized because middle-class people wanted to use Sure Start services. I've never heard anyone say that's a crap school because middle-class people wanted to send their kids to that school. This was enormous success. First ever program designed for poor people that everybody wanted. I'm tremendously proud of that. I still am proud of that. And I think if we can do it in terms of treating people with dignity and respect, doing some negotiations on what they think the problem is. I mean, one of the things about government is that we want people to want what we think they need. But they usually don't. And that negotiation is a very subtle negotiation, and it's very highly skilled in terms of frontline staff. So that dignity and respect is really important. And the other part of dignity and respect, of course, is diversity. So I can't resist. I have my best diversity story, because people always think diversity is about race. But I think it's very complicated. So my complex diversity story is my family. I do have a complex family in terms of diversity. My sister, this was 30 years ago now, probably less, 25 years ago. Anyway, she got divorced, and it turns out that her first husband was gay, and they had 2 children. And all the adults were in corners talking about what impact would this have on the children, having a gay father. And because I'm a children's rights person at heart, I asked my niece, who was then about 9, and I said to Lisa, I didn't say, how do you feel having a father who's homosexual? I said, Lisa, how do you like Ken? Because Ken was her father's first boyfriend. And Lisa said, Ken's very nice, but he's not Jewish. absolutely true. Absolutely true. Ken's long gone. Lisa gets on really well with her father. So, so I think that the notion about diversity is really, really important to think in complex ways, because all of us have some diversity in some way in our families, in our friendships, and if we don't, we're the poorer for it. Yeah, it's really, really important. The other thing that I recommended in terms of cross-cutting was that the comprehensive equalities legislation should consider poverty a protected characteristic, should consider disadvantage. And I have to say, I was in the room with civil servants when this was suggested, and at the time I thought it was completely nuts. And I said, what, are you going to make it illegal to have bad parents? Yeah, I thought it was just bizarre. But having looked at it again, and having looked at it in the context of what we're trying to do on poverty, if we had to look at every piece of policy to screen it for, well, what impact does this have on poor people, we might have better policies. So just in terms of finishing up, tackling inequality is much harder than tackling poverty, because to tackle inequality, there are losers as well as winners. And I think that we've never been able to address this issue about losers as well as winners. And I have to say to you that, part of the problem is me. Because I get my winter fuel allowance, and I don't even have to apply for it. I don't have to stand in a queue. I don't have to fill in a form. I don't have people stare at me. It arrives in my bank account. It's a disgrace. The problem is me, because I'll do anything to make sure that my child's okay. Because all good parents will. And leveling the playing field is really, really hard, because when we talk about relative social mobility, for your kid to go up, my kid has to go down. And because inequality is so wide, the steps are terrifying. In more equal countries, the idea of going down isn't so terrifying. And that's why more equal countries have better social cohesion. But the problem is me. And I think we have to do something about me, like take away my winter fuel allowance, but leave me my bus pass, because it's probably good for the environment that I take the bus instead of getting in the car. Proportionate universalism is very, very popular, but I defy anyone to explain to me how you do proportionate universalism without targeting, because it's targeting by any other name. But that decision on what's targeted and what's universal, we just don't get those systems right in any system. These are really, really hard things. And the last thing I want to say is family income alone does not guarantee good outcomes for children. Many of us will know this from our own families, that the risk is higher for poor kids. But it doesn't mean that the kids who aren't poor are all going to be fine. We know that many of them aren't. And it doesn't mean that the kids who are poor are all going to be screwed up, because we know that most of them aren't. And the difficulty is that we stereotype and are disrespectful to poor people when we always talk about the risks associated with poverty. My favorite one is in trouble with the police. So if you have all these disadvantages and you're poor, your child is 10 times more likely to be in trouble with the police than the wider population. When you look at the actual numbers, it's 10% versus 1%, which means 90%, even with all these difficulties, are not in trouble with the police. It's terribly important that in our attempts to be fair and just and have a better society, we don't wind up castigating the people who we want to work with to make life better. Thank you very much.
Some questions and answers. We've got quite a lot of time. We're going to run to definitely no later than 7:30. What I would like to do is ask a few requests in terms of how we do the questions and answers, though. The first is we have a microphone somewhere, so if you could wait till the microphone's there, because we're recording the session, then we'll hear you. If you could introduce yourself, and we will try and take 2 or 3 comments or questions at a time for Naomi to deal with. So if anybody wants to put their hand up, we can get started. Kirsty will bring the microphone to them. We've got a couple here.
Thank you, Naomi. That was great. I wanted to ask, there are moves now to increase the number of people in higher education from disadvantaged backgrounds for quite some time now. But I think there's now more awareness of retention rates in higher education from people from low-income backgrounds and neighborhoods. And I'd be very interested in your thoughts around how we could actually support younger people in universities, which are often populated by young people from middle-class backgrounds. So any thoughts on that would be really welcome.
Okay, let's have another one.
Do you want to take that?
Hi, Naomi. I really commend the Sure Start programme because I was a young mother in the early 2000s and I lived in Deptford in South London and I did attend a lot of the Sure Start programmes, and perhaps we wouldn't have needed the Poverty Truth Commission if there was that level of social mixing, because, you know, we live in a very polarised society. But I was just going to say that I hear all the time in Scotland, maybe voiced in England too on the left, about there's always a desire for universalism because the alternative is residualism, and I kind of hear that you don't really run with that. So I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on that.
Right, shall we
We'll start with those two?
Yeah. I'm not an expert on higher education, but what I would say is that there needs to be forensic attention right through school life on children from poor backgrounds and on the social class gradient. So if by the time you get to university you haven't had that forensic attention, it's pretty tough. So there can be ways, I'm sure that Tim can tell us because this is his business, but I think that in terms of education, we need to have a much wider view about what education can and can't do. And I think that there's also an issue about how do you make sure, certainly in primary school, that parents are engaged in education, because parental interest is a key factor in education. My issue on the young people is, while I would like to see people from more diverse backgrounds in universities, I also would like to see that university isn't the only answer. Because I think in England, the policy of going for 50% was a huge mistake, and put people through courses that actually did not lead to the career enhancement that we would have expected. So I think that, you know, a university education is valuable because it's a scarce commodity, and as soon as it gets too wide, it loses its value. So it's about what's appropriate for each individual. On the second one, on universalism versus, I just think that, you know, do I believe in a universal health service? Yes, I do. But do I think everybody should get treatment for diabetes? No. You know, a universal system doesn't have to mean that everybody gets the same. In fact, if everybody gets the same, it's an unfair system. The question is how in health we're very relaxed with how we target because we have a more physical health view. It's that in other social interventions, it's much harder to decide on how to target. But I think that there are, you know, I certainly think things like all older people getting the winter fuel allowance is crazy. You know, I think that's completely nuts. I probably think that about free school meals as well, because I think that you wind up having huge amounts of money spent that could have been spent more productively in a more focused way. And it's a trade-off. But universal education, universal health, of course, yes.
Okay.
Hi. In relation to young adults, one of the issues that often strikes me as difficult is how young people can find out what job is going to suit them. Because in the past, when employment was much easier to obtain, young people would move through different jobs. But now, because qualifications are often required much more, and it's really important that you're doing something that you're going to be suited for. But have you any views about how you can kind of overcome that, particularly for young people who are not going to university and, you know, are going to be looking for other routes?
Okay, and there's another gentleman just 2 rows back.
Thanks, Naomi. Enjoyed the talk. I was very taken by the forensic analysis that you described at the very start, and I was curious about a couple of things. One was to what extent, how long that took. You described it as an iterative process, and I was curious as to how long it took to get the question right, which is what I thought you were doing there. And my second question really comes on from that is, to what extent a forensic analysis like that is easier in the current Scottish climate than you might have found in the UK, for example, because of different media pressures. A lot of the time it seems that policy is reactive to media pressure. I suspect it's different either side of the border.
All right, okay. On the young adults, I think we leave exposure to the workplace much too late. You know, like 14, 15, 16, I think it should be late primary. I think having a week in a just trying out different kinds of workplaces, not just because that may not be what you want to do, it's more just understanding how work works. You know, so I think we should be doing a lot more of that at a much younger age. And I think that also deals with working with employers about what the skill mix is needed locally. How do you tie the skill mix to what people are learning at school? I mean, a lot of these things are in policy already, but I don't think that there's enough forced attention to them. You know, so I think that we need to think about that much younger, and I think there should be more fluidity about, you know, you go into a job, but maybe you decide then to go to university. You know, the real fear now is that with the minimum wage not kicking in until 25, at 16 you'll go to a very low paid job. The lower pay the wages, the less likely the employer invests in the employees. And so you're stuck. So that's what, you know, and then, you know, by the time you're 25, you'll lose the job because they have to pay you that much more, and you wouldn't have had those years of which should be developed, you know, what really good apprenticeship should do. But I think also starting much younger is important. On that, how long it took a few months, and I kept thinking they're going to get really annoyed with me, and I have to say they didn't. But it was more about, you know, finally asking you know, when the numbers jumped out and you saw these were the big numbers, then it was clear, these are the policies we have to look at. But that took a little while. I would say it took about 4 months. But, you know, this is the thing about being within government, was having the analysts who could do it. So that was really, really helpful. And I think that it would have been more difficult had I had to, I mean, I couldn't have done it myself. It's not my strength. You know, I couldn't have Googled these things out of the woodwork. So I think that having the analysts who were used to dealing with those numbers kind of knew what question I was asking, but it took a little while to figure out why I was asking it, where we were getting to. And then it sort of jumped out at us. Was it easier in Scotland? I think that in some sense it's easier because, you know, there was a government that wanted it to happen. So that, of course, makes it easier, and that there was a lot of iteration on what I was doing, you know, so that I felt that we were going with the grain of what we wanted. But the one thing that makes it more difficult in Scotland is that a lot of the data is UK. And I had to keep asking, and I kept, you know, sometimes I'd forget to ask, and I wasn't sure whether it was UK data or Scotland data. And sometimes it's not broken down, sometimes it is. And then there will be some data that I'm really familiar with, education data, and I have to keep reminding myself, all the education data I know is England. I don't have the Scottish education data at my fingertips. So that distinction was always very important, to make sure that I was making it, you know, Scotland specific. Some of it was easier, some of it was harder.
Come on there, and then the lady here.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. Poverty and inequality in Scotland seem to be very deep-seated. Can you identify other countries where they've actually solved it? And if so, what are they doing that we are not?
In my heart of hearts, I think there's a big cultural difference. Sorry, I was supposed to wait, but I'll
No, it's okay. I'll just get the microphone there.
Everyone points to Scandinavia, and they're you know, small countries. Scotland's a small country. I think that in the Anglophone countries, except for Canada, and I don't know what's happening in Canada, but boy, it's fantastic. The Anglophone countries do not trust government to spend their taxes. I really think it's as simple as that the countries that seem to have got it cracked have high tax regimes, but they also have good public services, and they believe that the government will deliver good public services for high taxes. And that fundamental, and the difficulty is that those are very strong cultural beliefs that work or don't work. But I think that that's a fundamental part of it. I remember being at a conference, it was a childcare conference, and it was one of these, they did a parent survey, and is childcare too expensive? And of course everyone said yes, and we have proof that childcare, and I said, well, did you ask in the survey, are you willing to pay more tax? And of course they didn't ask that question, and that's the key question. And it's the key debate in Scotland, on, local tax, income tax, whatever. I mean, my bugbear is inheritance tax, which I feel very safe in talking about, because no political party will say we should have a whopping great inheritance tax. But if you're interested in intergenerational social mobility, inheritance tax dead people. I think it's a great idea.
Naomi, we're a small country, and the government has made a specific attempt, obviously, to work better across departments rather than in silos. That said, do you think it has to be a multi-silo effect, a multi-silo move forward? In other words, much more collaboration, looking holistically at the point of the curve to which you've made reference. And what steps do you think should first be taken on what time scale to actually affect the curve?
Gentleman just at the back there.
Donald McCrea, trustee of the David Hume Institute. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned, I think it was a 30-page document outlining policies which in some way refer to dealing with inequality or poverty. And I believe you mentioned probably just two which you strongly recommended you would change, school meals being, or free school meals being one of them. So what's the other 29?
Okay, I'll do that one first. That wasn't the document I referred to was just a note about these are all the things that we do already. And I don't even know if free school meals was on there. I can't remember. What I was saying was that it wasn't, for me, specific enough in terms of what I was trying to do to help me get to where I needed to go. And that's why it was a false start, and I went back and asked for the numbers rather than the policies, because I wanted to be able to look at some very specific policies rather than trying to do everything really fast. On the other one, the cross-government what steps, I think some things need to be cross-government and some things don't. So my English example of that was the literacy and numeracy strategy, which I know a lot of people hated. I think it was brilliant and it worked. But the only reason it worked was because the center of government at the time had every single lever. So most parents do believe it's a good idea that children learn to read and can add up. So you've got the public on your side. Most children have to be in school. Most schools then, although not necessarily now in England, are taught by teachers. So you have a delivery mechanism, you have a common view about what the goal is, and you have the lever to push that goal and say all teachers have to do this. But there's almost no other policy like that, and that's why you need the join-up. So I don't think that you do the join-up for its own sake. You do it because what you're trying to achieve requires it. And sometimes the difficulty is when you get them in the room together, and this is my experience with Sure Start, is that they have different think bubbles. So everybody thinks they agree, but you can tell that underneath they actually don't, but they won't say it out loud. And I always felt that my job was about making those think bubbles explicit. And that's where, my rant about, is the child care for employment purposes or child development? Because the delivery mechanisms are different. But nobody wants to surface those differences. And that's why cross-agency is so difficult, because people all have their own think bubbles, and they think everyone understands where they're coming from, and they don't. So I think most social policy does require cross-government working. But I don't think the cross-government working should be for its own sake. It should be because the policy requires it. And there are some policies that don't, and you just get on and do it. I wish there were more of those. There aren't.
How are we going to get the wins?
What are the wins, the quick wins? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I think we've already had some quick wins. I mean, I had this amazing experience with my first meeting with the First Minister. I said to her about teachers in nurseries, and she announced it a week later. I mean, the civil servants were just looking at me in amazement, and some irritation, I have to say, which I have sympathy for, having been a civil servant. But, so there are, it's the trouble with the quick wins is that you don't notice them, and they don't get chalked up, and they don't get recorded, but they happen all the time. I can give you another example again from England. When Liz Truss said that to enter childcare training you need GCSE, grade C in maths and English, that for me was a quick win. The amazing thing, it was a fantastic thing. Her office was ringing me to ask for quotes, and I was willing to give her quotes because I thought it was so fantastic that they were at least putting some entry requirement to working with young children. But the sector thought the requirement was too high. And that's why I worry so much about who works with our children. Because if we're worried that a C grade in English is too high to work with children, then we're worried about their language development. We have serious problems. So I think there are lots of quick wins, but they're small and they don't make big headlines. But for the people who do them, and this is a sort of tactical issue, this is a real, I have sympathy for ministers of all sorts because they wouldn't be, it's hard work, and they wouldn't be doing it if they didn't want to change something, and they never get told well done. Ever, ever, ever. And boy, you can get a lot out of a minister if you say well done.
Gentleman here.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating evening. The First Minister makes a great thing about closing the attainment gap. And I just wonder, there are lots of factors involved, obviously some of them from poverty, some of them from inequality and other areas, I'm sure. Were you able to offer any help on closing that gap?
All right, do you want to pick another one?
Anybody else just now? Oh, there's one over there.
I was really struck by The Problem Is Me, which I thought was very compelling, and I wondered if you'd any prescriptions for how you tackle the me problem. I'm a lawyer, and I don't think law is necessarily a good way of tackling that kind of problem. Is it a cultural issue? Is it a moral issue to persuade people that the problem is them?
Okay, the first one's easier. Right. Personally, I don't think it's possible to close the attainment gap, but I think we could narrow it. There isn't a country in the world that doesn't have a social class gradient, but the gradient is more or less steep, and ours is very steep. So I think that we can make the gradient less steep. I don't think you could ever close it. I just don't believe that you could, and I think there are natural differences within families, within cultures, within whatever, that make it very, very difficult. I think you can narrow it by, this is what's very irritating, is that we know that the most important thing in child outcomes is the home learning environment. So everybody says, good, let's do more in the home learning environment. What we don't know is how to change behavior. So all the efforts on the home learning environment, the actual evidence for them working are very, very thin. But we know that high quality early education works. And we know how to do it. And we don't do it because we're more interested in employment or in teachers or whatever, but we know exactly what to do. We could do it. That would significantly narrow the gap in terms of school entry. We have very good evidence from EPI on that. And EPI evidence now goes right through to 16, where you get narrowing the gap. So we know exactly what works. For some reason, we don't do it. But it's not that I don't believe parenting programs are good. I think they're great. I think that, they help a lot of parents. It's, fine. It's just that it isn't the answer. Because the evidence about whether it works or not is still very thin, and it's just very hard to change people's behavior. You know, any of us, it's very, very hard to change behavior. What was the second one? I lost
About the problem is me.
Right, the problem is me. I think that's very tough, and I think that part of that is the way we organize opportunities in a wider sense. I mean, narrowing the gap will help that. I think that parents have a very natural inclination to want to do the best for their children. Sorry, I'll just, 2 stories, and this is why I think you'll never close the gap. When I worked in a nursery in Milton Keynes on a low-income estate, this was the early 80s, and we did stuff on gender, and one of the mothers said to me, she had a 4-year-old, and she said to me about Stuart that this gender work was really important, because maybe when he grew up, his wife would have a job and he wouldn't. She didn't want him to feel bad. This was a loving parent who at 4 was assuming that there was a good chance her child would be unemployed as an adult. This was not a feckless mother. This was a loving mother. This was a time when the miners' strike was on, when Sheffield, steel was closed, when for women of that class, white men were losing their jobs all over the place. She really cared about him. She thought his best chance was to marry a rich girl. Maybe she's right, but it's pretty depressing worked for my husband. It's pretty depressing for a 4-year-old, roll forward 15 years, and I'm a senior civil servant in the Department for Education, and my colleague is taking his daughter to her interview at Cambridge University, and in the car, he'll describe to her how the interview works, because he went to Cambridge. He's doing the best for his child. He's not cheating. He's not slipping them a tenner. He's doing everything he can for his child. And that's what we all do. But our resource to do the best is very different. And our belief in what the best is different. And I think that makes the closing of the gap virtually impossible. But I'm not hopeless in terms of 2 issues. One is forensic attention to quality in education, I think, will make a big difference, as it is making a big difference in London. And London really is a miracle, and we have evidence now that it does make a big difference. But I think the other thing, which is more cultural and more difficult, and that I'm sure everyone in the room, certainly including me, is guilty of, is that the steps are very steep in inequality. So if the consequences of not getting there are so great, our fight for our children will be that much greater. And therefore, that issue about who goes up and who goes down, that's a very, very long-term issue. Because unless we do something about inequality, we will all fight to protect the space for our children.
Do you still want to ask? There you go. So one here and then one there.
Thanks very much. It was, again, an interesting presentation. My take on poverty is influenced by 20 years that I spent in policing, which I wouldn't be as naive as to think that the sorts of households that I went into were typical of people that were in poverty. But I certainly formed a view that poverty tended to come about when a person's sense of entitlement sort of overtook any maybe civic responsibility, you might want to call it that, to invest or to apply themselves in a way that they would get a return. And I would think of examples like, having also been a school governor, abdicating your responsibilities as a parent because you would expect the education system to pick it up for you, or not looking after your own health because ultimately you would expect the NHS and the free services to pick that up for you. And I suppose even in a crude sense, stealing because you think that you're entitled to take that thing even though you haven't earned to provide it for yourself. I just wondered if in your assessment of poverty, if it's this modern attitude about entitlement, and I have no idea how to fix it, but what people think they're entitled to is something that is a modern issue that we're not properly addressing.
Tim O'Shea, University of Edinburgh. That was wonderfully rigorous and convincing analysis, Naomi. Earlier answering your question, you suggested I might comment on the university issue. So before I ask my question, I'll do that. I mean, I think the key thing is it's not to do with getting into university, and it's not to do with getting a job. It's to do with being successful
in education at different levels, including, and it's to do with being successful in employment. And therefore, it means the sort of analysis that you're doing, Naomi, is exactly right. You know, we don't, you know, working participation is important, but, you know, well, something that really grieves me in terms of universities at the moment is working participation into universities matters. But look at the situation in part-time higher education in Britain, particularly in England. It's going massively down because of the way it's being funded. And that is, in objective terms, a much, much more important route into tertiary education, the part-time route, than the other thing. So I think there is a real issue of it isn't, does the school leaver get into the fancy university? It's how does the course of going through the education system prepare you to go into university or college, and how does the subsequent course prepare you to engage in part-time education of some description? The question, I mean, you're immensely polite about everybody. Politicians are wonderful. I don't think, even with some colleagues here, I don't think I've ever heard anybody be so positive about ministers. And and obviously you're immensely positive about civil servants, and who wouldn't be? I guess a sort of critical undertone that's been in your talk is to do with the level of professional skills needed in care homes, needed in early years. And we see, particularly in England, some very strange things where amateurism of different types, the notion that, experienced middle-class people don't need to be trained as teachers because, they're experienced middle-class people, so of course they can be teachers, or of course they can make major input into other parts of the social services. And I wonder, what your feeling is on how one works to ensure that there is recognition that to be successful with a 3-year-old or an 18-year-old or somebody in poverty does require a level of serious professional development. It's not something that you can just do.
Right, okay, I'll do the first one first. It's very interesting, that question, because when I first came to live in Britain from the United States and heard about things like welfare rights, it was a very weird expression. Yeah, welfare was bad. Rights were, you didn't have a right to welfare. It just was a very weird expression for me. So I suppose I was kind of where you were in terms of the police. My experience of working with poor people is it's slightly more subtle. It's about planning. And it's about how far ahead you plan. So the way I describe that is that I had this sense of, when I was growing up, that if I worked hard, I'd get into good university. If I got into good university, I'd get a good job. And funnily enough, all that happened for me. So every time I was reinforced for the planning that was long-term planning, and it was hard work. So it didn't come automatically, even the things it's all hard work, but each time my expectation, then something happened to me where it didn't happen. My same brother-in-law, actually, I'll tell you, this is the same brother-in-law who was gay, was diagnosed as HIV positive. This was about, again, 25 years ago, and I said, are you going to give up smoking? And he looked at me like I was nuts. I'm going to be dead in 2 years. Why should I give up my one pleasure? And funnily enough, combination therapies came in. He's still alive, and he did give up smoking. But the difference was that he had an outlook where he saw some hope for the future. And my experience of people living in poverty is the worry about the next meal, the worry about the next week. I mean, the story that I didn't tell, which I'll tell now, is, when I met with the Poverty and Truth Commission, one of the women was saying how she was really worried about running her tumble dryer because of the bills. So she had 3 teenage boys, and so instead she was putting the wet washing on the radiators, and of course it makes the flat steamy, and then you get mold. But the important part for me was that she was worried about the bill. She didn't run up the bill and run into debt. She was worried about the bill. One of the other women in the group said, don't wash it, just spray it with Febreze. Luckily, this woman said, nah. But I think that issue about time frame is what I would see as the entitlement thing, about how long ahead you can plan and whether you believe it will happen. So just one more story on this. There's a big study about children about the marshmallow test. Has anybody heard about the marshmallow test? Right, okay. So the marshmallow test where, you take one kid and you put a marshmallow in front of them and say, if you wait 5 minutes, you'll get 2. And you go away for 5 minutes to see if the child will eat it or not. Well, if the child eats the marshmallow, they're doomed because they have no planning skills. My view is the child who eats the marshmallow has been lied to by adults. The child who eats the marshmallow says, yeah, and she told me we were going to go to the zoo, but that never happened either. And if I wait, she might take it away. So I think there is a different mentality in terms of trust and planning. And yes, I certainly have met people who I think they're entitled to stuff that I find absolutely astounding. And I think, what, are you kidding? Get off your butt and get a job. But I've also met people who work incredibly hard, and still life is very tough for them. So it's not that I don't recognize what you're saying, and certainly I've seen it, but for me it isn't the majority. And that's the difficulty.
And the second question was about professional skills levels.
Right, professionals. Yeah, I don't know how you do it, because these are very, very big ticket items. That's the problem, is that if you want them to be professional, you have to pay them higher salaries. I reckon that, one of the reasons why you don't have really good people in early years anymore is feminism. What woman would tell her aspiring, brilliant daughter to go into early years? Why did you wouldn't find me in early years anymore. That's how I had this brilliant career, because no one else was in early years that had a degree. I do think this is very, very expensive. Because if you want good people to do these jobs, you have to pay them decent wages. And if you don't pay them decent wages, you're not going to get good people doing the jobs. And it's really interesting how even in, the gender thing in the sort of the skill stuff. So somehow it's less so now, but it's still the majority. The really, really good chefs turn out to be men. The really, really high-paid hairdressers turn out to be men. So you get that playing out of those gender gaps in what are highly skilled areas. But, all of a sudden you get those gender differences. And I think that you would do a lot in terms of the gender pay gap if you took the caring professions, which are largely women, and trained them properly, gave them decent wages, and you get much better care.
Gentleman here. Elsa, blue jumper.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I'd just like to ask you, how do you balance your three sides? Because in introduction, academic, you have a bit of understanding the public sector and private sector. And those three, in my experience, those three sectors tend to be pulling against each other. How do you juggle that and provide the advice as well?
I have to say, I've never worked in the private sector, except I worked in my dad's shop when I was a little girl. But I've never worked in the private sector. I've only worked in the public sector and the voluntary sector. But I have worked at the front line and in policy, and kind of later in academic. I don't think of myself as an academic. I think of myself as an academic groupie. And I've always really, really been interested in the science, but I've always wanted to be on the doing and policy side. What drives me crazy, okay, so I'll be a little impolite, Tim, so I'll be impolite to academics. What drives me crazy with academics is that when we do the study, we'll get, on the basis of the current evidence, considering all the factors, one could conclude possibly that, and there's 5, and you'll get 6 pages of methodology, which is absolute gobbledygook. And I have to, on all the papers that we do for the evaluation of children's centers at Oxford, I do the introductory policy context, and I do the conclusions, and I try to read everything in between. But for the academics, the methodology is really important because that establishes the seriousness of the science. And to academics for each other, I understand why that's really important. But for policy people, just tell me what it says. And that's why I'm not a good academic.
there is one that's always in there, I find, which is that further research is required.
Oh, yes.
I wanted to abuse my position to ask a question, actually. And also just to say again, it's an immense privilege to hear you speak again, and I really enjoyed it. But I wanted to ask about the employer view, because you made recommendations about employment, and you talked about if you went and asked health visitors and what have you, what they do. If you went and asked business, they would say you need more businesses in schools and what have you. I suspect if you ask school children, they don't want financial services businesses coming in and talking to them. I think their aspiration is mostly around being a celebrity or maybe a footballer or something in a lot of surveys that are done. So how do we as financial service industry or government, that's where the jobs are in Edinburgh, tourism maybe. How do we get young people, schools, actually aspiring and thinking it's for them and not for other people?
I think part of it is getting the kids into the business, not getting the businessmen into the schools. Just to walk around, just to see this lovely building, just to see what the offices are like. Pardon me, to look at your computers, I know that, you'd have to blindfold them or something, but, kids can probably run them themselves these days. But I think that's where it has to go. I think that when, my conversations with employers are always that, the people who come out of school don't have the skills, or they don't know how to do an interview, they don't know how, and I think that's besides the point. I think that there isn't enough really serious work about, so what are the skills that you need? And how do we get them in? And how do we get kids interested? On the celebrity thing, there's a great story about the fantastic black tennis player, Arthur Ashe. Arthur Ashe used to go around high schools in Brooklyn telling black kids not to be athletes. Because the difficulty was that their only role models were athletes and the entertainment industry, which were very, very high profile. But they didn't see black teachers. They didn't see, black people in ordinary work. And Arthur Ashe's story for them was just cause, most of the National Basketball Association are black people, it doesn't mean most black kids are going to be in the NBA. And that's always this problem about how do you work with children about who they look up to and how rare that is. And I have a friend, I was talking about him the other day, a black kid who, well, now he's 40, but when I knew him when he was 10, I thought he'd make a great PE teacher because he was very, very sporty, but not gifted at any single sport. Well, what he's grown up to do is the 21st century version of PE teacher. He runs health clubs. He's phenomenally successful, much more so than he would have been as a PE teacher. But that notion about what he loved and then tying it to what he could do as an adult, it just worked for him,
Can I ask the opposite side of that, the benefits that there are to employers in having within their workplaces young people with different characteristics, whether that's race, disability, or any other characteristic, and just what evidence there is of that?
Well, there's evidence about the difficulties about groupthink, but there's also hard work about how you bring teams together. So I think that just doing it isn't enough. It's much more about, I have to say that the number of times that I get asked to go to meetings on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur drives me completely crazy. So there are once you try to have a diverse workforce, then there are responsibilities in what you have to do as an employer to make people feel comfortable and part of that. So it's not easy, but it's really important, and it does enhance the business. I'll come and work for you.
Okay, maybe take one more question and then we'll go for drinks if there is a final question. We'll take both.
Just very quickly, I mean, you mentioned the idea that it's the ability to plan ahead, and I'm thinking back to Adam Smith's own work on theory of moral sentiments, and particularly the emphasis on the virtue of temperance as actually a practice that has to be inculcated through education.
Yeah.
How do we actually manage that? And particularly, I'm thinking in terms of what my students are interested in, which is all about behavioural science and changing the choice framework so that people actually don't realise that they're being guided into behaving well.
I don't understand the question.
All right, don't worry. Well, have you come across the nudge theory? I mean,
Yes,
yes.
yes,
I mean,
yeah.
how do you, are there it's quick wins again? Can we
Yeah.
nudge people into behaving well?
I think, well, I think it works for some things, but I don't think it works for most things. But for the things it works for, I have no problem with it. If it means that the toilets are cleaner because you pee on the bee, it's fine. But I mean, the really good one was about in New Mexico. The mothers didn't want to put the children in car seats because it's God's will whether the children die in a car accident. So they got the priest to bless the car seats. I'm completely relaxed with going with the grain of what people believe if that gets the behavior that you want and it doesn't do any harm. But I think for most of the things we're talking about, it's more complicated and more difficult. And it is that difficulty about, I know what a good home learning environment is. But telling someone to do it isn't going to work. And I don't know how to nudge them to do it either. That's the difficulty. That's the difficulty.
Hopefully an easier question. Having focused on poverty in your first year and assuming that there will be a second year, will your focus be more on inequality and the perhaps longer term actions required to tackle inequality?
The answer to that is easy because, first of all, I don't know. I don't know if there'll be a second year. And then it's up to the negotiations with whoever it is who asked me to do the second year. So I'm being very, very careful in terms of, So, I mean, the answer is I absolutely don't know. I think that in terms of what I can do, I think I'm much weaker on inequality. I think I can bore you for ages on what the problem is. But I think the solutions are really very, very difficult and I don't have them. So the answer is probably no, I probably wouldn't agree to do that because I'm not quite sure what you do. Very honest.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand over to Ray now, who's going to say a few words.
Very good. Can I just ask you all to thank Naomi for a really fascinating talk, first of all, and then for answering the questions so frankly, and we hope you do get reappointed if you wish to be reappointed by whatever government we have after May the 6th, and maybe in a year's time we'll get your reflections on your second year and what you've learned. Can I also thank Sandy and Standard Life for hosting us here. As Sandy said, there are drinks outside. Don't drink too much of them because they come off my pension. Please continue the discussion there. Just an announcement about the next event from the David Hume Institute, which is on May the 12th. We were going to have Paul Johnson, Chief Executive of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, talking about the economic outlook, but Paul can no longer make it, so his deputy, Carl Emerson, is going to come and talk for us instead. Paul is the guy that you see on television. Carl is the man that does the work. So I'm sure it'll be an excellent discussion, but now thank you all for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed the evening, and please join us for a drink.